in the heart of the kingdom of Ardentia, like a strange monument to ancient gods, rose a giant tree. It seemed to tear the heavens apart with its gnarled, mighty branches, sprawling so wide that no mortal gaze could take it in completely. It was not merely a tree, but a portal between worlds, a guardian protecting Ardentia from the invasion of sinister entities. It was called Yggdrasil, and legends claim that only the ancients knew its true power. At the very core of Yggdrasil's crown, a massive sword pulsed with a haunting glow, as if left there by a titan of old. Its blade pierced deep into the trunk, and dark energy pulsed through the metal, making the tree tremble with pain. Yggdrasil felt the agony, and every leaf, every branch whispered of it. Hovering over this sword was a young man, about 20, with rebellious curls and a slightly mocking gaze hidden behind glasses. He held an ancient book in his hands. Before him stood two wolf-headed beings. One of them, his eyes glinting with hatred, spoke. "Jenner?" he hissed, his voice filled with dark contempt. "What do you want this time?" The mage waved dismissively, adjusting his glasses, smirking as if he were meeting old friends on an evening stroll. "Not even a greeting, old friend," he replied casually. "I'm here on business. Didn't expect to see you. And with you, I see, stands none other than the old hero Elheim. My respects." He gave a mocking, theatrical bow. The old wolf, called Targorn, scowled and growled through gritted teeth. "Who are you to jest with death? Oh, why do you look at me so grimly?" Jenner smirked again, but this time something ominous flickered in his eyes. "I haven't done anything bad to you, yet. But I'm short on time, so I'll ask you not to interfere." Targorn's frown deepened as he scrutinized him. "Could it be you're an apostle?" Targorn spoke, his tone laced with caution. This time Jenner's smirk faded and he fixed the wolf with a cold gaze. "An apostle, eh?" he scoffed. "How did you guess? They told me you were dangerous, but I didn't believe it. Perhaps I should have." He smiled mockingly again, casting a contemptuous look at him. Suddenly Targorn lunged forward without a word. The air whistled, a faint flash darting past, and Jenner vanished, reappearing several meters away in an instant. The humor had drained from his expression. He understood his opponent was serious. Jenner started to say something, but again, Targorn struck like lightning, forcing the mage to teleport repeatedly. They moved so swiftly it seemed as though shadows flickered in the air. Then, in a sudden twist, Jenner vanished from the wolf's sight, as if dissolving into the air. Targorn tensed, closed his eyes, and seemed to listen intently, holding his sword at the ready. He melded with the surrounding nature until he heard the faintest whisper of wind signaling magical presence. In that instant he lunged and slashed his sword. A wild scream of pain echoed and blood spattered on Yggdrasil's ancient roots. Jenner materialized in the distance, his severed arm left lying on the ground, hatred boiling in his eyes. He muttered an incantation, and in a flash, the bleeding stump healed as if there'd never been a wound. "I shouldn't have underestimated you," he hissed. In his remaining hand, a blue crystal appeared, radiating a cold, dark light. Richard, watching the scene, recognized it at once, the very same from the Temple of the Moonlit Night. The traitor had stolen it, causing mayhem. The crystal flared brighter, and Targorn sensed the impending threat. Before he could act, Jenner directed the crystal's magic toward the enormous grim sword lodged in Yggdrasil's crown. The sword absorbed the energy, sinking deeper into the tree. Yggdrasil cried out in pain, and the ancient magic wavered, tearing the veil that shielded the world from evil. Soon, the crystal disintegrated in his hands. Richard stood, breathing heavily, watching as the giant sword in Yggdrasil's crown sank deeper, as if a dark ritual was draining the tree of its life and strength. He felt the pain as if the tree were speaking to him, pleading for help, an echo of anguish reverberating in his mind. Jenner, still hovering, cast a grim look down at them and coldly said, "We'll meet again." His figure faded into the air like a shadow. Once he was gone, the sword abruptly halted, as though its energy source had been exhausted. But the old wolf scowled, muttering a grim phrase. "It seems this is far from over." Then he turned to the hordes of creatures flooding the horizon. There were so many they blended into a continuous wave of darkness, moving like death itself toward them. Yet the old wolf only nodded at Richard. "Deal with them." Richard, seeing the monstrous horde before him, gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and murmured, "You're not going to help me?" To which Targorn replied with a smirk, "No. Remember how to wield your power. Let it flow through you like a bridge." With these words, Richard unsheathed his sword. In his mind, a familiar voice whispered, "You can do this," murmured Elric, his voice brimming with an enigmatic confidence. "Just trust me." Richard felt the magic surge through his arms as he advanced toward the monsters, ready to fight. He took a deep breath and tried to focus, as Targorn had once taught him, on the magic of the ancient druids, a primordial force that was to awaken within him. The first attempt was clumsy. Richard swung his hand, trying to unleash a wave of energy, but only a faint flicker of magic trickled from his fingers, quickly fading, leaving him momentarily stunned. The monsters drew closer, growling and hissing, their fangs glinting in the twilight like scalpels. Elric in his hand vibrated like a living being. Richard felt the sword guiding his movements, helping him keep his balance and repel attacks. Every creature he struck with the blade dissolved into a bloody mist, yet they kept coming. His armor, too, seemed to live its own life, absorbing blows that could have knocked him off his feet. Richard continued to concentrate, and with each attack, he felt his power grow. Slowly, gradually, the magic of the druids began to awaken, the flow of energy finally taking shape and bending to his will. At that moment, his body became like a conduit, the sword an extension of his soul. He launched himself at the enemies with renewed strength, tearing them apart with each blow, and didn't even notice when the fight transformed into a dance of death, with monsters becoming mere shadows in his path. And in the midst of this bloody battle, he sensed movement above. Richard looked up and saw a figure hovering in the air. His friend Lance, shining with a spear bound in dark energy, gazed down at him. Richard straightened, brushing off another monster, and asked, "So, are you done?" Lance nodded, smiling slightly. "Yes, it wasn't easy, but I learned a lot." Richard smiled back, feeling a strength within himself that had been previously unreachable, realizing that now, together, they could face whatever lay ahead. They continued fighting side by side, their movements perfectly synchronized like longtime allies who could understand each other with a mere glance. In battles like these, their connection became almost tangible, a fine but resilient thread binding their souls together. Every strike Richard landed was accompanied by a wave of magical energy, flowing subtly through his body. At first it was a faint current, barely noticeable, but with each passing moment it grew stronger, like a stream suddenly filled with rushing waters. Richard swung his sword, channeling the energy of the ancient druids, his blows becoming increasingly powerful and lethal. But just as he felt he'd reached the peak of his strength, he realized all the monsters were vanquished. He straightened, catching his breath, and looked around. The ground was littered with the remains of the creatures. Mangled bodies and severed limbs covered the earth like grim testimony to the brutal fight. Richard ran his hand along the blade, wiping off the blood, and walked toward Targorn. The old wolf stood slightly off to the side, watching the battle with satisfaction. "Not bad," he said with a reserved nod. "You handle the sword well." "Thank you," Richard replied, smiling. "I was trained by a monk named Balthazar." "Balthazar?" Targorn raised an eyebrow. "So he's the boy I remember. I trained him once too. Haven't seen him in ages." Richard looked at Targorn in surprise. "You were his teacher?" "Yes," the wolf chuckled. "Once he climbed up here and begged me to take him as a student. I refused, but he knelt outside my house for 3 days. Stubborn kid. I had to agree. He trained with me for 10 years, then left. I haven't seen him since." Richard and Lance exchanged surprised glances, pleased to learn something new about their friend and mentor. But at that moment, Richard felt dark energy waves once more, emanating from the sword stuck in Yggdrasil's crown. The tree shuddered faintly, as if wounded. Richard frowned and asked Targorn, "Do you know Jenner, and what he did with that stone?" The old wolf's face darkened, and his voice grew grim. "He's one of the apostles. It's been a long time since I last saw one. The last apostle who came here I managed to destroy, but this time I allowed him to channel energy into the sword." "What are the apostles?" Richard asked. "You'll learn later when the time comes," Targorn muttered. "I can only tell you that their goal is to saturate this sword with energy so it reaches the heart of the tree. When Yggdrasil falls, the boundaries between worlds will thin, allowing dark forces to enter." Richard listened intently, marveling at the hidden dangers in this world. He looked over the lands of Ardentia, imagining how many people, living their ordinary lives, had no idea of such a threat. He understood why the old wolf couldn't leave this place. He was the tree's guardian, its protector. As Richard pondered this, Targorn interrupted his thoughts. "You handle energy pretty well," he said. "Much better than I did back then. I was just a village bumpkin and a farmer, and it took me a long time to get used to it." He scratched his head as if recalling his past, then continued, "You've finally earned Elric's trust and can now use his powers. Apart from transformation, the sword can absorb curses. Remember when I spoke about the types of magic we can wield? There's moon magic, druid's magic, and the magic of the wolves. You can also learn nature magic, mastered by those two who left earlier." Richard glanced down at the ivy bracelet on his right wrist. The leaves were still fresh, as if alive, with a slight shimmer along the tiny veins, as though they held the tree's very blood. He didn't know why the goddess had given him this bracelet, but he sensed some magic within it. Meanwhile, Targorn continued, "The magic that bears a bloody hue and wild essence is wolf magic. It grants healing and other physical abilities, but it also changes your appearance. To transform, you must channel it into the sword, which will become its vessel. But remember that with the transformation, you lose some of your strength, so be cautious." "Will I ever be able to become fully human?" Richard asked, hope in his voice. Targorn shook his head. "Unfortunately, no. Only the Mother of Wolves knew how to break the curse permanently, but she perished without revealing her secret. Also, you'll only be able to keep a human form during the day. At night, wolf magic intensifies, and the sword struggles to contain it. But it's better than nothing. I myself can no longer wield it since I removed the seals using the crystal skull." Richard sighed bitterly, realizing that the dream of a fully human life would remain out of reach. But at least he could temporarily take on a human form. Gripping the sword, he asked Elric, "Will you let me do this?" "Of course, friend," Elric replied. "Just focus." Richard closed his eyes and began to recall the sensation he'd felt when he first tapped into wolf magic. He felt the dark red energy rising from the depths of his being. This power was warm and alive like blood, but tinged with the primal instincts of a wild beast. He directed it toward the sword's hilt, which began to vibrate faintly in his hand. The energy flowed stronger and he focused, as if holding back a torrent of molten lava. The sword glowed as though absorbing this power, and at a certain moment, Richard felt his connection to wolf magic weaken, as though the sword had taken control of it. He sensed each drop of power being drawn into the metal, while his body, on the other hand, felt lighter as it freed itself from the weight of that energy. With each passing moment, the wolf magic sank deeper into the sword, a faint glow forming around him. He felt his skin gradually losing its beastly traits, as if the barrier between him and his human form was falling away. Richard noticed his body had changed. He was smaller, leaner. Curious, he looked down at the hand gripping his sword and couldn't believe his eyes. It was human, like it once had been. A shiver of excitement ran down his spine. He lifted his gaze, meeting the astonished expressions of his companions. Lance, finally breaking into a smile, said with a hint of mockery, "Well, well, turns out you're quite the looker." Richard flushed, then laughed. He looked at the sword's blade, where his former face, a youthful human one long forgotten, was reflected back at him. His heart skipped a beat, overwhelmed by a rush of joy. He saw himself again, the person he was before all this had happened. He paced back and forth, squatting to test out his old body. It felt oddly familiar yet foreign at the same time, and he realized he was weaker than in his wolf form. Swinging the sword, he practiced his familiar moves, savoring the sensation. Wanting to test the strength of his magic, he focused on the moon's power. A soft glow enveloped him, and with a single swing of the sword, a beam of light shot toward a rock, shattering it into thousands of fragments with a deafening crash. The feeling was incredible. Moon magic flowed through him, bending to his will. He then tried the druid's magic, but here he faltered. He could feel it, but couldn't control it as easily as in his wolf form. This magic seemed better suited to his beastly side, acting as a bridge between his two natures. Lowering his sword, Richard bowed to Targorn and said gratefully, "Thank you for helping me." Targorn only nodded, his gaze focused. "If you keep training," he said, "you'll be able to transform at will, even at night, though only briefly. And by the way, the armor you're wearing adapts to your body. It's crafted specifically for people like us. When you use it, focus on the stones and the veins you see on it. They're amplifiers that will assist you." Richard nodded, realizing his armor was far more complex than he'd thought. Targorn continued, "You've passed the first stage of training, mastering the magic and learning to control the sword. But there's a second. It's a technique I once taught to Balthazar, and it'll help you defeat Erixor. That demon was created by Sharak, but in the past I didn't have a chance to battle him, and he was only sealed away. Later the matriarch asked me to destroy him, but I can't leave this place since I'm bound to this sword. So you'll have to deal with the demon yourself. I'll teach you one technique for that." Targorn pointed at the sword. "It's unique. It's not only inlaid with a magic stone and holds a soul within it. It was crafted in the image of this giant sword, which belonged to a titan from another dimension. Our craftsmen studied it and managed to recreate something similar. They also unlocked a secret hidden within it." With these words, the old wolf turned and made his way toward the hilt of the giant sword. The path wasn't easy. High cliffs and strange obstacles rose around, shaped by the blade over the centuries. As they moved, weaving between rocks and dark ledges, strange creatures began attacking from the shadows. A beast with long, clawed limbs, leathery wings, and eyes glowing like embers leapt out from behind a boulder, lunging at them. Richard shifted back into his wolf form just in time, raising his sword to block the attack. His blade pierced the monster's scaly hide and it fell to the ground with a hissing scream. But then two more sprang at them, thin, wolf-like creatures with jaws filled with teeth as sharp as glass shards. Richard and Lance fought in harmony, fending off the creatures that seemed to emerge from the darkness itself. Lance wielded his spear with cold precision, his movements exact and deadly. When a monster tried to ambush him from behind, the vampire sidestepped, letting it lunge past, then drove his spear into its back with a swift motion. The creature let out a strangled hiss and slumped to the ground. When the attack subsided, Richard, catching his breath, asked Lance, "What did you find out in that cave? Did you learn anything about your ancestors?" Lance nodded, his eyes glinting slightly in the dim light. "Yes, I gained much knowledge and grew stronger," he replied, his voice carrying a deeper resonance, as if echoing an ancient power. "I discovered our ancestral nest, the place where my clan originates. The records say the path to it is perilous and hidden, but it's possible some of my kin are still alive." Richard clapped him on the shoulder, smiling warmly. "When we're done with this demon, I'll go with you. I'll help." Lance nodded gratefully, his gaze softening momentarily. And at that moment, Elric suddenly interrupted. I feel something. A call. Someone is calling me. I wonder what it is." Richard frowned, looking back at the sword. "A call? Who could it be?" "I don't know," Elric replied, his voice distant. "But I feel it's a call for help." They pressed on, soon arriving at the hilt of the giant sword. The area was remarkably clean, as if ancient magic protected it from time and decay. Beneath the dusty metal, intricate lines of stunning beauty emerged. Targorn began clearing the area, and Richard noticed a diagram engraved into the metal, complex patterns surrounded by runic symbols. The old wolf beckoned them, and they stood in a circle, following his instructions. He closed his eyes and focused, and Richard felt magic begin to flow slowly through him, enveloping the diagram. It started to glow, and a sudden flash of light made Richard squint. When he opened his eyes, they were in a different place. Before them stretched a vast hall, like an endless corridor leading into darkness. In the center stood towering walls, forming a maze that wound deep into the hall like an infinite web. Targorn turned to Richard. "We're here. You need to make it through the maze, overcoming all obstacles. At the end, you'll find your answer." Richard cursed softly, feeling his shoulders sag at the thought of more trials. "Why can't anything ever be straightforward?" he muttered, gripping the sword's hilt. Lance and Targorn remained at the entrance, watching as Richard took his first step forward. The labyrinth before Richard looked ominous and ancient. Towering walls of dark stone, coated with moss and mold, rose toward the ceiling, vanishing into the darkness. The pitch-black shadows devoured every corner, with strange symbols occasionally flickering between the stones, glowing faintly with a greenish light. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the very earth beneath the labyrinth was steeped in ancient magic, hanging on the edge between the world of the living and the dead. Richard stepped inside cautiously, each step echoing off the hollow walls. His question broke the silence. "Elric, haven't you been here before with Targorn?" The sword spoke quietly, its voice deeper. as though memories gave it weight. Yes, I've been here before, but there was no calling then. Perhaps the stone used by the apostle has changed something. The call now comes from somewhere at the end of the labyrinth, and I want to find out what it is. Follow my directions and we'll get there faster. Straight, then left, and straight again. Richard followed his guidance, listening to every sound. When he asked which way to go next, Elric commanded, "Now to the right, and duck." He barely ducked as arrows whizzed overhead, embedding themselves into the stone walls behind him. The labyrinth was indeed full of traps. They moved on, maneuvering past obstacles under Elric's guidance, and soon a new challenge appeared. A moat of dark water blocked their path. A worn wooden boat swayed at the edge, its boards cracked and slimy in places. "Get in, but be cautious," Elric warned. "Dangerous creatures lurk in the water." Richard climbed into the boat and pushed off from the shore, making it glide across the water with a creak. The silence was unsettling, but soon it was broken by a splash. Something suddenly broke the water's surface. Skeletal forms of strange water monsters emerged, their bony bodies draped in seaweed, with hollow eye sockets glowing with a dead light. They snapped their jaws and reached for him with clawed hands. Without hesitation, Richard drew his sword and began to fend them off. His first blow shattered the skull of one creature, but another immediately surfaced nearby, reaching for him with a clawed limb. Richard parried, driving it downward, and the creature fell back into the water, where its bones quickly sank. Two more tried to climb aboard, but Richard, wielding his sword skillfully, severed their limbs, sending the remains back into the moat's depths. Each attack from the monsters grew more desperate, but finally, Richard fended off the last wave, and they successfully crossed the dark moat. Ahead, a new barrier appeared, a shimmering, translucent veil, vibrating as if alive. It pulsed with a mysterious light, breathing rhythmically. "This will be the hardest trial," Elric warned. "You'll need all your strength here. The veil affects the mind, drawing out your fears and pain. You must let go of your past, or you'll be trapped here forever. I'll stay with you as best I can." Richard nodded, gripping the sword tightly, and took a deep breath before stepping into the veil. Instantly, he felt a dense, sticky sensation envelop him, as though the darkness of the veil was seeping into his mind. When Richard found himself in the dense shadows of his nightmares, everything suddenly changed, and he was transported to a place filled with his most painful memories. Before him appeared the faces of people who had once meant everything to him. First, he saw his beloved, the one he'd dreamed of spending his life with, but who had betrayed him. She stood there, laughing and embracing another man, the very one for whom she had left him. Beside her was his mentor, a man he'd respected, the one who had taught him everything he knew, and who, on that fateful day, had pushed him off a cliff. Then came the faces of friends, one after another, all those who had betrayed him at different points in his life. They surrounded him, laughing, as if mocking his trust and pain. Despair closed in around him like a dense whirlpool, pulling him deeper. His heart tightened with anguish. He felt the world growing darker, as if the darkness was enveloping him from within, poisoning even the smallest glimmers of hope. But suddenly, through this hell, he heard Elric's voice. "We're here." Those words, like a bright light, pierced the darkness, anchoring him back to reality. Mentally, he latched on to that voice, and image by image, he began to remember those who had been with him in recent years. Agna, Balthazar, Lance, Finn, all who had become family, friends, people he could rely on. The memories of the betrayers began to fade, and his vision cleared. He was standing in a grand hall, and a voice in his mind softly spoke. "Well done. You did it. You know, Targorn was trapped here much longer. The loss of his family held him here for ages." "Where are we?" Richard whispered, looking around. The hall was modest, and in the center stood a stele, engraved with mysterious symbols and images. He approached it, and the symbols seemed to tell a story. Figures displayed movements, arrows indicated energy flows, revealing secrets of channeling power within the body. Watching them, Richard recalled the powerful strike Balthazar had once used to destroy a river monster. In that moment, he understood how potent and destructive that skill was. Sitting before the stele, he delved into studying the symbols, absorbing the details. Time slipped by unnoticed, but when he stood up, his gaze was full of understanding. "I think I understand," he said, barely containing his excitement. "Now we can leave this place." But before he could take a step back, Elric spoke again. "Wait. I hear that call again. I want to understand what it is." Richard sensed his friend's insistence and, not wanting to leave Elric unanswered, moved in the direction from which Elric seemed to hear the call. They walked behind the stele and discovered a narrow passage. The corridor was so tight Richard had to stoop. Elric, sounding almost surprised, murmured, "I don't remember this passage. It might have opened recently." The corridor was narrow and damp, the air carrying a faint scent of ancient dampness. The stone walls were lined with fine webs, and tiny drops of water seeped through the cracks, trickling downward. After several minutes, they found themselves in a small cavern. In its center stood an old chest, covered in dust and cobwebs, yet strangely it was open and unlocked. Richard approached it, carefully lifted the lid and peered inside. There, amidst the shadows, lay a large egg, the size of a head. Its shell was covered in intricate patterns, as though nature itself had etched ancient symbols onto it. The egg was warm, as if it held something alive, though Richard couldn't hear the slightest sound. "Take it with you," Elric advised. "I don't know what it is, but it might prove useful." Richard nodded cautiously and placed the egg in his bag, next to the blue crystal skull, before they started their way back. The return path was simpler, and soon Richard emerged to where Lance and Targorn were already waiting for him. The old wolf eyed him, nodding with satisfaction. "You did well," Lance added, his voice carrying a hint of urgency. "You've been gone a long time. We're running out of time and we must hurry. The demon will reach the city soon." Richard paled with alarm. "It's been nearly a month," Lance confirmed with a grave nod. "Yes, we have a week left. We need to return at once." Without wasting another moment, they departed, setting out for the city, whose fate, and that of all Ardentia, now hung in the balance. When they reached the canopy of the giant Yggdrasil, Targorn paused and whistled, a sound like the call of an ancient beast echoing among the branches and leaves. Soon, a familiar lizard approached them, a huge, powerful creature with sturdy claws and leathery membranes, allowing it to move effortlessly along the trunk and branches of this colossal tree. Targorn turned to Richard, his eyes shining with kindness and a hidden sadness. "This is where we part. I hope you handle the dangers ahead. Sharek is breaking free, but I believe you can stop him. In the worst case, if things get truly dire, I will come to help. But I'm sure we'll meet again." Targorn extended his hand, and Richard, feeling deep gratitude and respect for the old wolf, shook it. For a moment warmth flared in his chest, a sense of appreciation for all that his wise yet stern mentor had taught him. Saying farewell, Richard and Lance climbed onto the lizard's back, gripping its rough skin tightly, and the giant creature began its descent. The way down was thrilling and nerve-wracking. The lizard moved swiftly, its claws digging into the bark, leaving deep scratches on Yggdrasil's smooth surface. It slid down, occasionally seeming to lose its balance, but each time it quickly returned to its intended path. Richard held on tightly, his heart pounding as each lurch and jump sent tremors through his body. Passing by massive branches, they and Lance finally saw the ground, which looked impossibly far below. At last, with a soft thud, the lizard landed on solid ground. Richard felt the earth beneath his feet, giving him a sense of reassurance and calm. After their long journey through the giant tree, he was relieved to be back on solid ground. Jumping down from the lizard, they saw that Finn and his uncle were already waiting at the base of the tree. Finn, as usual, was reserved, merely asking briefly, "Everything went smoothly?" Richard, smiling slightly, nodded, still in his wolf form, and choosing not to reveal yet that he could now transform into a human. He decided to keep this secret for later. They set off back toward the village. The road was no less dangerous, but after all they had endured, they overcame every obstacle with ease. When they finally returned, Richard was greeted by the joyful bark of Enzio, his loyal dog, who had noticeably grown and now nearly matched in size the fierce bear Liutii. Both beasts, Enzio and Liutii, welcomed their masters, licking their hands and growling happily. Richard approached the village elder, who blessed him with ancient words of farewell. After saying goodbye, he set off on his journey, feeling revitalized, knowing he was ready for the battles and trials ahead. Thomas had always dreamed of serving in the city guard. Since childhood, he'd watched with admiration and respect as people looked up to those who knew the cost of the city's peace. The guards protected citizens from threats, and while the work was dangerous, it was honorable and well paid. Only the best could become part of this elite unit, and Thomas had prepared for it from a young age. And now, his dream had come true. He had become a guard. But before he could fully assume his duties, troubling events began to unfold in the city. First, a massive influx of refugees gathered at the city walls, followed by the overthrow of the regent, and soon the crowds of refugees were allowed into the city. To top it off, one day Thomas witnessed a demon, resembling a colossal worm, attempting to break through the walls. The sight filled him with genuine terror, making him wonder where his service would lead him in such troubled times. He knew he was no coward, but the sight of these creatures inspired a fear that could shake even the sturdiest of warriors. Yet he stood firm at his post, knowing that this duty was his destiny. As he patrolled the wall, Thomas noticed members of the Order of the Golden Tower passing by him. They wore dark robes with the tower symbol on their chests, and never spoke to the guards, remaining immersed in their mysterious affairs. But Thomas paid them little mind. His gaze was fixed on the horizon beyond the walls. He watched as the last groups of refugees made their way to the gates, and once they were inside, the gates were locked. Suddenly, something strange caught his eye beyond the wall. From this height, he couldn't make out the details, so he asked one of the Order members for a binocular. The member was slightly surprised by the request but handed it over. Thomas raised it to his eyes, holding his breath as he peered at the scene. Approaching the city, he saw countless hordes of monsters swarming like ants, and his body prickled with goosebumps. "What the hell is this?" he thought as he realized an entire army of creatures was marching on the city. In a panic, he reported what he'd seen, and soon the bells rang, shattering the tense silence. Chaos erupted around him as warriors rushed to ready weapons for the impending attack. Catapults and trebuchets loaded with heavy stones and fire-laden projectiles were prepared along the walls. Archers pulled their bowstrings and massive ballistae were aimed at the gates, ready to pierce the enormous bodies of the attackers. But then Thomas saw something that made his heart stop. On the horizon, a dark figure appeared, slowly moving toward the city. At first it was a barely visible dot, but with each moment it grew larger, and Thomas realized this was no ordinary beast. It was a giant monster with dark tendrils spilling out around it like waves of inky darkness. This darkness absorbed light, creating a sinister, suffocating shadow around the creature. Thomas felt his legs buckle, and he collapsed onto the stone floor of the wall, gripped by despair. Could the city withstand such a threat? Paralyzed, he suddenly noticed one of the guards beside him shouting and pointing. Thomas looked in the indicated direction and saw two enormous beasts racing toward the city. There was a colossal bear, taller than any house, and a wolf of equal size with silvery fur. Humans were visible on the backs of these beasts. A horn sounded, and the gates began to open, though Thomas wondered who could have given that order. Soon, both beasts were inside the city, and the gates clanged shut behind them. Thomas looked once more at the approaching monster, clenching his fists as he thought, could these newcomers save the city? A glimmer of hope flickered in his heart, that they might be able to stop the looming evil, but he knew this battle would be a severe trial for everyone. Richard finally arrived at Kaltar. As he crossed through the gates, he immediately spotted Tyrion approaching on horseback. It seemed news of his arrival had spread. They exchanged greetings, and Richard quickly asked the pressing question, "Have Lucia, Agna, and Balthazar arrived?" But Tyrion shook his head, a shadow of worry crossing his face. "No, they haven't, and there's been no word from them." Richard frowned, unease gripping him. What could have happened to them, he wondered. But there was little time to dwell on it. The massive demon Araxor was closing in, its dark shadow already visible on the horizon, like a growing black curtain creeping toward the city. On their way to Kaltar, Richard and his companions had done their best to avoid encounters with the beasts lurking at every turn. But now, within the city walls, they could at least catch a brief respite. Soon they reached the walls and climbed to the top, where they could survey the forces assembled for defense. The army stationed along the walls was armed with bows, spears, and siege weapons. Stones and metal projectiles were ready for the attack, and the archers stood poised, awaiting orders. Several members of the Order of the Golden Tower approached, and Richard exchanged a greeting with their leader. "What's the situation?" he asked, glancing over the army before looking back to the dark horizon. "When the hordes of monsters draw close enough, they will begin the assault," replied the Order's leader. His voice was firm, but Richard sensed a hidden tension within him. After a moment of thought, Richard asked, "Do you have anything that could send me into the air? Something with enough force to carry me over the barrier?" The Order's leader looked startled, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You're planning to go beyond the walls?" Richard nodded, explaining that he needed something to help him leap across the barrier. He hadn't yet mastered, as Balthazar had, the ability to create footholds in the air that would allow him to walk above ground, which complicated his plan. Deep down, Richard regretted not having asked Balthazar about this technique. Worse still, with Lucia and Balthazar not yet in the city, he couldn't rely on their help. But Lance spoke up, his voice steady and resolute. "I can help with that." Richard knew Lance might be able to manage it, but he was reluctant to put his friend at such risk. Approaching Araxor was dangerous, even for a seasoned warrior, and this mission could end in tragedy. However, Lance was insistent. and his determination was unwavering. In the end, Richard agreed, feeling they had no other choice. All they could do now was wait, watching the dark clouds beyond the horizon, knowing that soon the battle would begin, the battle on which the fate of the entire city depended. The hordes of monsters filled the horizon like a dark river rolling toward the city. The creatures moved with eerie, drawn-out sounds, their bodies a grotesque blend of animalistic and demonic features. Claws, fangs, limbs covered in black fur and scales, monstrous faces twisted with rage. Their eyes glowed with a crimson fire, fixed on the city walls as if already claiming their prey. Dark tendrils of shadow trailed the monster army, consuming light and turning the field before the wall into a grim, forbidding place. The guards on the walls watched as the first wave of creatures surged toward them, and fear gripped their hearts. But as the monsters began to climb the walls, the commander issued the order. "Fire!" Archers drew their bows and released a volley of arrows, raining down upon the monsters, which fell one by one, pierced by metal tips. Boiling oil poured from the embrasures, coating the walls in a slick, scalding layer. Monsters scrambling up the walls slipped and fell, shrieking in pain as the burning oil scorched their bodies. Some tried to claw into the stone blocks, but the slippery surface, now drenched in a mix of oil and blood, made climbing nearly impossible. Members of the Order of the Golden Tower joined the fray as well. From the embrasures, they unleashed powerful blue beams from stones mounted on their staffs. These blasts of energy tore through clusters of monsters, incinerating them to the bone. Some Order members stood directly on the walls, brandishing swords and slashing at any creatures that managed to climb higher. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of burning flesh and acrid oil filling the air. On the ground below, bodies of monsters piled up, but the oncoming beasts trampled over their fallen kin, pushing relentlessly forward. The fortress walls rained stones upon them, crushing monsters into bloody smears on the earth. Catapults and trebuchets on the walls launched heavy projectiles, each impact echoing through the fortress. Arrows fell like rain, piercing dense ranks of the creatures. Then, the towers dividing the wall sections began to glow. On the stone blocks at the tops of the towers, rotating magical crystals emitted blue beams that swept over the horde. These beams burned entire rows of monsters to ash. Yet, despite their losses, the monsters kept coming, undeterred. Meanwhile, the darkness emanating from the massive demon, Erexor, began to envelop everything around it. It crept toward the walls, devouring light and turning day into pitch-black night. It felt as if the darkness itself was swallowing the very space around them, casting a sense of hopelessness over the city's defenders. The magic stones atop the towers, emitting their blue beams, dispersed the darkness only momentarily, allowing brief rays of light to pierce through. Richard stood on the wall, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the monstrous form, cloaked in darkness, drawing closer. Erexor moved with terrifying purpose, its enormous tentacles writhing like those of a giant octopus, reaching out toward the walls, ready to snatch anyone brave enough to stand in its way. The monstrous darkness around it stretched out, swallowing light and inspiring dread. Richard felt his moment was near, and he tightened his grip on his sword, preparing to make his move. When the massive demon drew close to the city walls, the towers rotated their crystals and unleashed blue beams that pierced the creature's dark body, leaving only faint marks on its hide. Erexor shuddered slightly, but continued forward as if these attacks were nothing to him. Watching this, Richard realized he had to act faster and with more decisiveness. He turned to Lance and gave a short nod. Lance understood without words, grabbed his friend, and took off into the air. Richard felt a surge of awe as he realized how easily Lance controlled their ascent. They climbed higher and higher until they reached the clouds, and the city below shrank to a tiny point. "Let go," Richard said once they reached a height that even Lance found intimidating. "Are you sure? This is incredibly high even for me." Lance looked at him with concern. "I'm sure. Let go." Suppressing his fear, Lance released his grip, and Richard plummeted like a stone. The air whistled around him and he squinted against the speed, focusing intently on his target. He envisioned himself hurtling straight toward the demon's heart. Amidst the wind and noise, he recalled the movements he had learned from the stele. A warm, potent energy began to flow through him, filling every cell of his body. Closing his eyes, he mentally reached out to Elric. "Are you ready?" "Always, buddy. Let's carve this beast," came the reply in his mind. Richard inwardly smiled, channeling the energy as he continued his rapid descent. His body began to glow, as if he were becoming a falling meteor. Finally, Erixor noticed him, and sensing the danger, extended its tentacles toward him. These dark, knight-like appendages reached for him, trying to snatch him from the air. But Richard, cloaked in a magical aura, sliced through them like a knife through butter. Not a single tentacle could stop his relentless approach toward the monster's body. When he was within striking distance, Richard raised his sword, channeling all his gathered power into it. Elric began to shine, absorbing blue energy as if drawing it from the very air. Remembering Balthazar's incredible strike, Richard mimicked the movement, pouring all his will and strength into this moment. He swung the sword and a blinding ray of light slashed through Erixor, splitting its body in half. The demon roared in agony, and the next moment, an explosive boom echoed. Richard was thrown back, and everything plunged into darkness. When he regained consciousness, he found himself enveloped in pitch black. In front of him, like a sinister beacon, a single burning eye pulsed. It was the same blood-red eye with a diamond-shaped pupil he had seen before. But now it was enormous, and behind it, hundreds, thousands of similar eyes began to appear, slightly smaller but all focused on him, as if assessing, studying his soul. Suddenly, he heard a voice echoing from the depths of some infernal abyss. "We will meet soon." The weight of the prophecy pounded in his head, and he lost consciousness again. When he awoke once more, he saw the battle raging around him. The city's army was finishing off the remaining monsters. Lance fought nearby, while Enzio and Liuti growled and bit at the creatures defending the city. Richard got to his feet, looking around and feeling weak from the impact, but he found no wounds on his body. Warriors around him were already celebrating their victory, and one by one they began to notice him. Cheers and shouts of gratitude erupted as they surrounded him, lifted him up, and tossed him into the air, loudly celebrating and expressing their thanks. Richard was stunned. He hadn't expected such a reaction. But the gratitude and congratulations didn't stop. Lance, standing nearby, also received praise, and Richard felt that they had managed to save the city despite all the challenges. Yet the image of that massive eye and the message of a future meeting lingered in his memory. The realization that he might have to face a god himself filled him with a chill and a deep fear. Back at the castle, Richard found that there was still no news from Lucia, Agna, or Balthazar. This troubled him deeply, and he knew that his next destination would be the capital, where he hoped to find answers to all his questions.